Hello, I'm Alan Zundell, and this is Political Dharma. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about something I'm calling an agenda for a new America. Many of you who are watching this probably started following me last year when I was covering the presidential election with a focus on independent candidates as well as the third parties, what I call alternative political parties, alternatives to the two major parties. And because you're either interested in one or more of the alternative parties or you're interested in the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who started out very strongly as an independent somewhere in the early months of last year. That's where you came to me from. But behind my coverage of these things was a political agenda. Now, I'm going to be talking about that agenda a little more today, and it's varied a bit over time as I think about it further and learn more. But it's been pretty steady on my central ideas for a while now, for at least a decade and probably more. But I didn't see any chance of getting these ideas, the set of ideas I'm going to present to you, into the public conversation through the major parties. At least one of the items, which is employee control of large businesses, just runs against the capitalist tilt of both major parties. And I didn't see any room for that. The reason I was covering other candidacies and other parties was essentially because I want to get these ideas out more into the public, have more discussion of them. And I thought the most likely way to introduce them was through the campaigns of these types of alternative candidates and the obstacles to these parties being an important part of opening the field to them. I was covering that and following that as well. But things have changed quite a bit with this last election. Let me say one further thing about why I had been covering what I had. With the ending of the election afterwards, I started to develop this idea or promote this idea of a third party project, which would be using a newer voting system, star voting, to determine which of the independent or alternative candidates for a particular office would have the most support among independent and alternative party voters as a way of trying to bring these parties a little bit closer together and talking with each other about their differences, finding what their commonalities are, and also working together to change voting methods into something a little more competitive and fair for them, which to some extent they're already doing. But I thought this was a way to both advance what I think is one of the best ideas for our voting system, star voting, but also get these parties talking to each other. Now, what's changed for me is that in this last election, presidential election, it's become clear that there are radical changes happening in the entire political system. For one thing, MAGA and Trump have completely erased the old vestiges of what was the major concerns of the Republican Party. They were advancing the cause of free markets and globalization of economies, and now it's more centered around nationalism and protectionism and making foreigners the enemies that they're taking advantage of either through immigration or through other states stealing jobs, so-called. My take on what's happening there is that this is going to fail. This is a last-ditch attempt to find a way to reverse the declines in living standards of ordinary Americans for the last 50 years, and it's not going to work. And then that party is going to be up for grabs as to which kind of ideas or policy program is going to take hold of it next. With the Democratic side, they become completely fragmented by losing this election, and it's not clear at all which other factions or maybe outside voices are going to introduce the next idea that Democrats can rally around if they're even capable of doing that. So we may see big changes continually going forward in both of the major parties. This is not a stable system right now at all. And for that, now I'm thinking, okay, let's go back to my original agenda and say, what I want to do is just promote this to see if I can find some discussion of it through this channel, which is what I've been hoping to do for a while, and then see how this system plays out so I'll know where I'm most likely to find traction, either through an alternative party or an independent candidate that is open to some of these central ideas that I'm presenting here, and then I can work through them and with them and try to lend my support to the parts of their program that I believe in, or maybe even one of the major parties will start to take an interest in a radically different kind of program. I don't think that's likely to happen, but I just don't know at this point about that. And I don't want to focus purely on changing voting systems and alternative parties and independent candidates when I think I don't have a long life yet ahead of me. Never know. My productive life might be another 20 years, it might be 10 years, might be 5 years. At my age, it's really hard to tell. So I want to get back to the meat of it and say this is the agenda I am proposing. And in this episode, I want to explain it, at least to those of you viewers who I can hold the interest of. And then from there, go forward in somewhat covering news and changes, but also giving more meat to the bones of these ideas on my agenda for a new America. So where does that leave us? This week, I did take a look at what's happening with Kennedy and with alternative political parties. Not a lot of big news there. I think Kennedy's become very much integrated into the whole Trump administration. He's doing the same types of things that are happening in other departments, laying off staff, changing the configuration of the, I seem to like that word today, configuration, changing the bureaucratic organizational chart of the Department of Health and Human Services, which he's now the chair of. His running mate, Nicole Shanahan, said she's not going to run for governor of California. So she's kind of taking herself outside of the political arena for now. And the other alternative political parties, when there's not a political campaign going out, a big political campaign where they can get some kind of attention, they're mostly scheduling their conventions and holding local meetings, preparing for upcoming elections at some point, talking about how they can do better next time around or improve their internal functioning. So this kind of a internal focus at this stage, right after big elections happened, and not of great interest to a general viewership, more of interest to people are particularly active in a particular party. All right, so where does this leave me? My agenda for a new America is something I'm going to be explaining in a lot of these videos going forward. And if you don't find it interesting, I've resigned myself to the fact that some people will simply leave the channel. And if the channel just dies a quiet death, I'll abandon it and find other ways to direct my energies towards promoting this project, I think. Never know how things are going to change around me, and I may have to change my strategy, which I've done for years and years. So let me back up a little bit. Where is this agenda coming from? I was in my early 20s in the 1970s when there was a big shift in politics from the previous New Deal Keynesian type of economic program to what became neoliberalism. And in the 70s, we saw manifestations of the need for change in reduced profits for big corporations, increased globalization, an assault on labor union advances, deregulatory initiatives in the government. So a lot of big changes happening. And then it kind of settled into this pattern of neoliberalism, a lot of free trade, a lot of global markets, a lot of deregulation and conservative type politics, what had previously been conservative but now outran national boundaries. There were economic changes behind that. And I eventually got interested in what was happening in Detroit, the area where I grew up in. I saw automotive factories in particular start to lose ground to competition from Germany and Japan. And then the big oil spikes of the 1970s made selling cars difficult if they didn't have greater efficiency, which foreign cars did. So there was a lot of layoffs in the car industry, and they ran into big trouble, especially Chrysler, with the government eventually had to bail out. I saw this happening. I saw friends of mine getting laid off, reading the news, not always understanding the world around me. I went back to college really at an older age, like in my later 20s, and originally was interested in religion, and then became more and more interested in politics as I started to see that my own spiritual journey and path led me into the conviction that my own spiritual path was one bound up with trying to work for a better world through politics, not as a candidate, but as more of a activist. So I switched to political science as a graduate student, studied these issues, thought about them, studied different ways of thinking about them, studied socialist movements and earlier progressive movements, all that stuff. A lot of history, some economics, a lot of government policy. I became a professor and wasn't really teaching right in the middle of the things I was interested in, but that was more of a sideline. Continued to study and eventually left academia because I did not see that as a good opportunity for advancing these ideas and for other reasons that I won't go into now. Started to get involved in changing voting systems with the movement for ranked choice voting and then for star voting, and also got involved in alternative political parties, the Green Party in particular, and watching what was happening with other parties. So that's what led me up to the current moment. And all that time, I've been developing these ideas, and I am convinced that they make more sense than what I am hearing from other types of political formations, like the progressive movement or the conservative movement or the MAGA movement or whatever else might be out there. I haven't heard a program that convinces me it addresses the economic changes that are really happening in a way that it could potentially find a more stable economic system that meets the goals that most of us would like to see. Not so much billionaires gaining wealth at the extent that they have and using that to take control of the government, not so much working people falling behind farther and farther and finding it harder and harder to at least get a decent standard of living, what they would have expected from the recent past. So a host of things. So let me go into this agenda now so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. I just put this up on my website, politicaldharma.com, where you can see it. And it's a very sketchy outline of the ideas that are incorporated in here. And you see the first has to do with economics, the economy. I call it an ethical economy because a lot of it is based not just on practical considerations for how an economy could run better, but also on the ethical assumptions that buttress that economic system and subjecting those to critique and putting it on a more solid foundation. The second one has to do with politics and governance, and there it relates to changes that we need in order to make it possible for voters and citizens to actually influence the decisions of their government, because there's been a movement in the United States, I've said this often, over 200 years, to make it more democratic. It did not start out very democratic, especially the Constitution was not exceptionally democratic, maybe for that time period around the world, but not even here in the United States. There were more democratic experiments happening in the new states of the United States than with the constitutional system of the federal government that was set up. So this is more, basic principles where there'd have to be a broader representation other than the partisans of the major parties. We see a lot of independent voters, a lot of people looking around at alternative parties. They are not satisfied with the two-party system. It's too limited a choice, and it's not representing enough people's desires for what they'd like to see happen. Voters are not always clear on what exactly they think would work, but they are clear on what they think is not working, and they don't see the major parties as really doing a great job of it. So broader representation of what citizens want for the government. You have to have a voting system that brings more points of view into it. Fair and competitive elections essentially means other parties are able to compete and bring new ideas into the system like they had in the past, at least, even though alternative parties didn't always win many elections. They did win some, and they were able eventually sometimes to get major parties to adopt their ideas. So fair and competitive elections means bringing more types of candidates into the field and having them actually have a chance of reaching the voters, and the voters seeing that if they vote for them, it's not going to be totally wasted vote. Political rights, that just goes down to First Amendment rights, which I think are the most important part of the U.S. Constitution. Rights of association, free speech, religion, the right to vote, to participate in government. in one way or another. So representative government, more representative. And finally, culture, a cooperative culture. And the bullet points here are peaceful cooperation between people rather than turning people against each other, mutual respect and understanding, which is not big today, and then personal spiritual development of each human being, making that an aim of our political and economic system, that each human being could be developed to their fullest capacities, not only intellectually and in terms of their ability to contribute to an economy and get a good standard of living out of it, but these deeper needs that people have that are not being well addressed right now. And that's what my new channel, Buddha Meets Jesus, is intended to do, is to introduce ideas into the culture that are contrary to what I see as the dominant religious influence right now, which would be Christian conservatism, that is a Christian support for conservative principles, conservative political policy programs. And I think their use of the Bible is not, even if you regard the Bible as the inerrant word of God, I don't think their use of the Bible is very, what I was going to say honest, but the connection between the Bible and the programs they're advancing to me are just not there. It's not really biblically based as they claim it to be. So on my other channel, I'm talking about religion, spirituality, and trying to contribute to a development which is already happening of a different way of looking at the future and how religion is changing. Anyway, I just put up a new episode there recently. Okay, so there's these areas. And let me say briefly, while I'm on that subject of the other channel, Buddha Meets Jesus, I did put up a new episode just yesterday, I think, in which I talk about 5 spiritual practices that are very commonly recommended and that I highly recommend, and talking about how they've worked for me and how I think you could utilize them yourself, giving some advice on that. All right, back to the agenda. Today, I'm just going to talk about the ethical economy, that part of it, the economic part of it, and read between the lines for you. So those bullet points don't give you a lot of information, and I have yet to try to write up something more full. Could turn into an entire book, so it would take some time. So today I just want to explain some of the main principles to make sure they're clear in your mind. All right, so let us go back to that and start with the very first one, which was the economy. The main principles I'm promoting here. Number 1, voluntary exchange of goods and services. Now, I am critiquing capitalism, and so the program I advanced could be considered socialism, and especially the next bullet item, you will see socialist elements in it. But I want to emphasize that this does not entail a stronger central government that's trying to plan the economy and force the production and distribution of goods and services into a overall comprehensive plan. I don't think that has worked very well, and I think it has obvious dangers of giving too much power to the central government that would be easy to abuse by a bureaucratic class, which is pretty much what happened in the Soviet Union, I would say. So I don't use the word free market, because that implies that everything has to be exchanged in a market using money as the medium for exchanges. There's voluntary exchanges that happen all the time. First of all, in a family, every member of the family, at least teenagers and adults, ideally contribute to the well-being of the family. And as members of the family, they each benefit from those contributions. So that's an exchange. People are doing the housework, people are contributing to the family finances, people are maintaining the cars and the house and improving upon them and all that kind of stuff. It's a voluntary exchange of goods and services between people who trust and care about each other. Happens on a slightly larger scale between friends. They exchange gifts. They help each other in times of need. They invite each other over for meals that they prepare. So they are exchanging things, making their lives mutually better without using money as a medium for that exchange. And I think the principle could be extended even further into ordinary economic relations. Maybe not entirely, but much further than it has been. Some of the things I've seen in this direction involve the internet and how people voluntarily put things up on the internet that would benefit other people. Information it could be and has been more free. People contributing to Wikipedia or people developing open source software that they make available on the internet. So they are not asking money in exchange for this. They're making it free. They're putting their labor in for free and then assuming that the world will be a better place and we'll all benefit from that, including them. So moves in this direction are part of the long-term socialist vision that maybe to the extent possible, we don't have to rely on money as a tool and we can trust each other a little more and find the work that suits us and contribute to society in the way that best suits us. And then all of us benefit. But outside of that, which is a pretty small part of the economy as we usually think of it, it would be a market exchange. I don't have a problem with a market. I do think markets do not have to be exactly as cutthroat as they are, and I will get to that with the next point down. All right, the next point, and this is to me the most important one of all, it's employee control of large businesses. That means that rather than a business corporation being run for the purposes of investors, which is just profit mostly, they are removed from the consequences of their decisions of their managers on the workers, on the community, on the natural environment. They're more removed from that and they just focus abstractly on the profit they're getting. And then that means that those businesses invest and run businesses in a way that are often socially detrimental, harming the environment, making life harder on the workers, presenting consumers with choices that are not always to their advantage, and so on. So what I like to see is that the control in the hands of the people who actually work in the corporation is obviously they're going to be making decisions that are giving a better deal to the workers in the business organization as their position in society is closer to the average consumer and a person in the community who's going to be affected by the natural environment, like a lot of pollution in their lakes or rivers or in the soil around them. They're going to be more sensitive to that. So they'll bring those factors in consideration as they hire managers and make decisions about how the business is going to be run. And therefore, investors would only have a role of putting money in and then getting some kind of rate of return back that's negotiated with the workers' organization. So here there's historical and contemporary examples of firms run by employees that I will be talking about in the future. So this is completely feasible, I think. Also means that over time, as workers take these other factors into consideration and not just trying to make a profit for themselves, just to be in competition with other firms, but in their negotiations with suppliers and with retailers and with customers and other people they interact with, they'll be able to bring those concerns in as well and probably move less in the direction of purely making decisions based on their financial interests and making decisions that are more like a family or a network of friends in which they're starting to think how this benefits or hurts other people who are very similar to themselves. So a big change in the mindset of people from the logic of capitalism to a logic of what I call a culture of cooperation, care. All right, property. How does it work with property? And again, this is a little different from most socialism you hear about, is that I would allow private property. And what that means is that it would be property rights plus responsibilities. I don't believe in a natural right of property that somehow there is a absolute, once someone owns property, it's absolute and no government can intervene with it. I haven't yet seen a philosophical justification for such a conception of private property. I do see a social beneficial argument for private property, which is that in owning your own property, you can protect yourself better from government tyranny. You have something to fall back on, something to use as a resource. So the social respect for private property is something that gives individuals a buttress against government coercion, especially if government falls into the wrong hands. Unfortunately, right now, most private property is held in very few people's hands. So it becomes a class-based government and a class-based institution protecting just a small segment of the public, whereas the rest of us don't have much protection at all. Okay, so private property, the rights would be you can own things, you can invest things, you can dispose of it as you will. And I'm not just talking about like personal property. I'm talking about if you can save money and invest it, you have decisions about where you want to invest it and how much risk you're willing to take for what kind of return. What you don't have, and this goes with responsibilities and the rights of working people in a business organization, people, human beings who do the work should be the ones making the decisions. That is an area of human freedom that I think has an ethical basis. And that means then that a property, someone who invests property in something does not have any right to control those who are working with it. They're outside that system. They're not doing the work themselves, unless it's a very small business where the owner is actually a participating manager, hands-on kind of person. Smaller businesses, that would be more the case. But in larger corporations, investment would be through vehicles like maybe community banks or bond markets or whatever it is, where you are only guaranteed that if the firm goes out of business, you have first claim on the sales of the assets. You get a return for that to make up for the money you lost, or a market rate of interest. You invest in this because it's a very safe business. It's a going concern that seems stable and doing well. So you invest in it and negotiate. This is the amount of interest on my investment I expect back. If it's a riskier one and you have more money to invest, you could say, okay, I'll take a risk on this business in the hope that they can give me a higher rate of interest. So you can invest, you can get a return, but you just don't have control over how that business is run. You do have a claim on the assets if the business falls apart, and you do have a claim, a legal claim on that interest in principal being repaid on schedule, or you can bring the business into court. It's a very different mentality of who's in charge here and who has the rights of others. The other responsibility property owners would have is that to make a claim on the natural world at all, whether it's land and that which is under it or on top of it, or the things made out of what is coming out of the land, like tools made out of iron and minerals and houses made out of trees and wood. Whatever your property is, whatever the form is, you have claimed a portion of the national world, of the natural world, and everyone should have access to the natural world that's sufficient to sustain their life. So here you have an obligation to pay taxes. And if you have a representative system that's truly democratic, people will not be trying to burden one segment of the public with higher taxes than another. We will have a tax system that's fairer to everybody and simpler probably. And part of that, big part of that, goes to supporting what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, so you have to pay tax on your property. Ideally, it would be tied to property, as making it clear that citizens are getting a return on their claim on the natural world that we all have as human beings. And losing the thread of my thoughts, so let's go on to the next point, and I will probably regain it in a moment. The final part of this is what I'm calling a universal guaranteed income. Not a universal basic income, because basic implies that that is fully sufficient for you to be able to support yourself in a acceptable standard of living. I don't see this as a responsibility of the national government to fully fund a basic income. I think the national government could shift funds out of military funding and a lot of just waste in the government that is there, and support a income of some kind going to every citizen. Those who have more would be being, not more of the universal income, but more income in general, would be paying higher taxes and thus getting more of the burden of funding this, while those who don't have as much will be at least kept from total starvation. So part of the guaranteed income would come from the national government at whatever they can afford and whatever is, what's the most they can do and acceptable to the citizenry. The state and local governments could also contribute depending on the standard of living in their area. They could add to the incomes of the people, add to the federal income. And finally, families, charities, and the rest could make up some of the difference. So I don't see this as necessarily promising everybody that the federal government is going to take care of all your needs, but at least it's going to say nobody would fail to have any money whatsoever to take care of their needs. And we all have a right to at least take care of our most basic needs. And so that is the set of principles that I am proposing. Give me your comments and reactions, and I'd be glad to take them into consideration and address them either in the comments section or in future videos. And that's about it for this episode. We'll see how news develops next week and what other aspects of this I want to bring up as we go forward. A lot to say about it. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you sticking around through this whole video if you have. And talk to you later.